In the pre-dawn darkness of December 17, 1944, near the small Belgian town of Hansfeld, the mighty roar of a Tiger tank's engine suddenly sputtered and died. The silence that followed would reveal one of the most profound realizations of World War II, a moment when the true nature of industrial warfare became devastatingly clear to those who had believed in the invincibility of German military might. SS Obersturmführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch in frustration, the metallic clang echoing through the frozen morning air. Below him, his driver desperately attempted to restart the 700-horsepower Maybach engine, but the fuel gauge told the bitter truth: empty. The reserve tank offered no salvation either. Around Peiper, the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, sat motionless like sleeping giants. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers found themselves paralyzed not by enemy fire, but by something far more mundane, yet devastating: empty fuel tanks. As Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen Belgian soil, he could see through the morning mist what appeared to be a gift from the gods of war. The abandoned American position at Hansfeld stretched before him, a critical supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly that fires still burned in oil drums, coffee remained hot in metal cups, and there, lined up in perfect military precision, stood rows upon rows of jerry cans. Thousands of them, bearing the distinctive olive-drab color of American fuel containers, waiting like a mirage in the desert for his fuel-starved forces. Peiper approached the stockpile with an almost reverent slowness, hardly daring to believe what his eyes were showing him. His adjutant pried open one of the cans and inhaled deeply, high-octane gasoline, the lifeblood his machines desperately needed. As his men began the frantic work of refueling their vehicles, Peiper walked among the incredible bounty, counting with growing amazement. The mathematics were staggering beyond belief. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push to the Meuse River, enough to potentially change the course of the entire offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single, relatively minor depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months of desperate rationing. Yet as Peiper stood among this petroleum treasure trove, watching his soldiers pour American fuel into German tanks with the urgency of men dying of thirst at an oasis, a crushing realization began to settle over him like the morning fog rolling across the Ardennes hills. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities of precious fuel, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then this war might already be over in ways that the German High Command had refused to acknowledge. What Peiper could not have known as he stood among those jerry cans was that 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all German offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, which had become the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht as traditional sources were cut off, had been systematically destroyed by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The Luna Works, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed only a pathetic 5,000 tons by September. The massive hydrogenation plants at Politz, Blechamer, and Brucks were operating at less than 10% off their capacity, limping along like wounded animals. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat that German leadership seemed determined to ignore. In 1944, the United States produced an almost incomprehensible 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil, while Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian oil fields, managed only 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with what amounted to horse-drawn logistics, fighting a 20th century war with 19th century resources. While America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance, Major Friedrich Sommer of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler had allocated 5 million gallons with typical grandiosity, but only half was actually delivered due to the transportation problems that plagued German supply lines. The German High Command was betting the entire offensive on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than strength, desperation masquerading as boldness. The Americans, meanwhile, had constructed an engineering marvel that dwarfed anything the Germans could imagine, a petroleum pipeline system stretching across France called PLUTO pipeline under the ocean, and the famous Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines with clockwork precision. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day, while simultaneously receiving 1.4 million gallons. They were actually accumulating reserves while fighting one of the most intensive campaigns in military history, a luxury beyond German comprehension. Joachim Peiper was no fool, despite the propaganda that would later paint him as a fanatical Nazi. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and a veteran of the brutal Eastern Front where he had learned the harsh lesson that in modern warfare, fuel was often more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive, the spear tip that would slice through American lines to the sea. On December 14th, just 2 days before the offensive began, Peiper had attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt in his assessment. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for approximately 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from its very conception, yet the offensive proceeded with the blind optimism of desperate men. As his column prepared to advance on the morning of December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders that revealed the precarious nature of their situation. Tanks would operate in single file to conserve fuel, engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes, and the capture of American fuel dumps was designated as priority 1, above even tactical objectives. It was a plan born of scarcity, attempting to fight abundance. The contrast with American operations could not have been more stark. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary with casual indifference, received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity. What represented a minor logistical note for the Americans would have been a miracle for the Germans. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine at 0530 hours on December 16th used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. Yet even this impressive display of firepower masked the critical shortages that would doom the offensive from its first moments. Peiper's column began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule, into terrain that would prove far more challenging than the planners had anticipated. The roads that appeared as highways on German maps turned out to be narrow country lanes, many paved and unsuitable for the massive vehicles designed for the open steppes of Russia. Within hours, traffic jams developed as the mighty war machines struggled through the dense Ardennes forest like elephants trying to navigate a maze. At Landshut, Peiper's first objective, they encountered unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men who held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 precious hours through sheer determination and superior positioning. During this agonizing delay, Peiper's vehicles sat idling in the cold morning air, burning precious fuel with every minute that passed. When they finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered only 20 miles, but had consumed 40% of their allocated fuel. At this rate of consumption, they would run completely dry before reaching the halfway point to the Meuse, a mathematical certainty that made their mission impossible before they had truly begun. The American supply depot at Hansfeld was not even considered a primary facility by U.S. Army standards. It was classified as a Class 3B depot, a temporary fuel station established to support forward operations. Yet what Peiper found there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German Panzer division. Obersturmführer Hans Gruller would later testify with amazement. We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, extending for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them before retreating. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher, far superior to what German vehicles typically receive. German engines, especially the temperamental Maybach power plants in the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good, causing engine problems in several German vehicles as they struggled to adapt to this unexpected abundance. As Peiper's men continued refueling, they made discoveries that would shake their understanding of the war they were fighting. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who could read English from his pre-war work in his father's import business, found shipping manifests in the depot office. The papers told an incredible story. This fuel had traveled from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the English Channel to Normandy, and then been trucked 400 miles to this minor Belgian depot. The entire journey of over 6,000 miles had taken less than 6 weeks, a logistical feat that dwarfed anything the German war machine could accomplish. I showed the papers to Obersturmführer Peiper, Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview. He read them twice, then crumpled them up. He said nothing, but his face went pale. We both understood what this meant about American capabilities. Private Ernst Kessler found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe would use in their entire offensive. The comparison was almost too staggering to comprehend. To truly understand the shock of Peiper's discovery, one must appreciate Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May of that year, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel, and pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to a mere 60. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations, while U-boats were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel fuel by running on batteries for longer periods. On the German home front, civilian automobile traffic had not been seen since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual liters, and farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows out of necessity. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil supply. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude oil and needed to find uses for it. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld filling their tanks, Peiper's column surged forward with renewed hope. They reached Bullingen by noon on December 17th, capturing additional supplies including rations, ammunition, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel depots scattered throughout the area. But these maps revealed a disturbing truth that would haunt German commanders. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroad seemed to have a depot, every town a reserve. The U.S. First Army alone maintained 3.5 million gallons in strategic reserve, more than the entire German allocation for the offensive. Peiper pushed on toward Ligneuville, where his forces would commit the infamous Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners of war in cold blood. Even this war crime was connected to their fuel desperation, as Peiper later claimed he could not spare the gasoline necessary to transport prisoners to the rear, a justification that revealed how thoroughly fuel scarcity had poisoned German thinking. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead had reached Stavelot, the site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons of precious gasoline. Here was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse River and perhaps beyond, enough to make their mission not just possible but successful. But as the first German vehicles approached through the gathering dusk, American engineers were already at work with grim determination. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach, and his orders were devastatingly simple: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline stored in jerry cans stacked across 15 acres, a petroleum ocean that represented more fuel than most German divisions would see in a year of warfare. At 4:30 p.m. on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard approached the outskirts of Stavelot, Captain Brewster gave the order that would echo through military history. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the towering stacks of fuel containers. White phosphorus grenades were distributed among the men, and Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first ignition device. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, he would later recall with awe. A wall of fire shot up maybe 100 feet into the air. Within minutes, the entire depot had become a raging inferno that could be seen for miles across the Ardennes countryside. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the winter sky, a funeral pyre for German hopes. The fire would burn for 3 days and nights, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back again with fuel to spare. Unterscharführer Weber described the scene with haunting clarity. The Obersturmführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames for perhaps 5 minutes without saying a word. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes battlefield, American engineers were systematically destroying fuel dumps rather than risk their capture by German forces. At Thierremont, 1.1 million gallons burned in spectacular pyres. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were deliberately destroyed in a single afternoon. In total, during the first week of the offensive, Americans intentionally destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel, more than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually incinerate millions of gallons revealed a supply system that operated beyond German comprehension, abundance on a scale that made their scarcity efforts seem almost quaint. This incredible waste was rooted in a logistical network that dwarfed anything the Germans could imagine. The famous Red Ball Express alone had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating around the clock in a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency. Each truck in this vast convoy consumed 40 gallons daily just to operate, meaning the Red Ball Express itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B received in an entire month of ration allocation. By December 1944, the American Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes that stretched across liberated Europe like arteries carrying the lifeblood of war. This system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel, with a regularity that German planners could only dream of achieving. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded on December 18th with bureaucratic precision, "Fuel receipts yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 224,000 gallons." The casual tone of this report, treating millions of gallons as routine bookkeeping entries, revealed the chasm between American abundance and German desperation. The pipeline system supporting Allied operations was even more impressive than the truck convoys. Operation PLUTO had successfully laid pipes across the treacherous English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from British refineries directly to the continent. A growing network of pipelines extended inland like a circulatory system. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily, while the Seine line moved another 650,000 gallons with mechanical precision. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily while simultaneously receiving 8.2 million gallons. They were actually building strategic reserves during the most intensive phase of offensive operations, a luxury that represented everything the Germans lacked and could never hope to achieve. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the mathematical impossibility of the German position became increasingly clear with each mile traveled. At Chenu, they captured another small depot containing 5,000 gallons, which was consumed within 3 hours of combat operations. Tiger tanks devoured 2.5 gallons per mile in battle conditions, while Panthers burned through 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, with its narrow roads and steep hills, fuel consumption increased by an additional 40%. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded the grim mathematics. By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons from various American depots. We were operating at a net deficit, burning fuel faster than we could capture it. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through their ultra-intercepts, knew exactly what Peiper's fuel situation had become. General Cartney-Hodges issued orders to all American units. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, in a display of logistical abundance that would have seemed impossible to German eyes, American C-47 transport aircraft flew 316 sorties delivering supplies to the besieged garrison at Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel to a single surrounded town than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed for their crucial mission. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged the determined defenders at Stoumont in bitter house-to-house fighting, the fuel crisis had reached a critical breaking point. German tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks rather than from actual battle damage, their crews forced to continue the fight on foot. Peiper made the agonizing decision to consolidate his remaining fuel supplies, perhaps 8,000 gallons total, enough for one final engagement or a retreat to German lines, but certainly not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were already looking beyond the immediate crisis of the German offensive. Brigadier General Morris Gillen submitted a request for 245 million gallons of fuel for January operations alone. The request was approved without discussion or debate, processed as routine paperwork in a war machine that operated on scales the Germans could barely comprehend. The contrast extended far beyond mere quantity to encompass fundamental differences in military philosophy and industrial organization. American vehicles were standardized for maximum efficiency and interchangeability. Sherman tanks consumed a modest 0.8 gallons per mile compared to the Tiger's voracious 2.5 gallons. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon when fully loaded, while their parts were completely interchangeable and maintenance was simplified through mass production techniques. German forces, by contrast, operated a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles, each with different fuel requirements and maintenance needs. French tanks required different oil grades than German Panthers. Soviet trucks needed different spare parts than German Opels, and each complication multiplied the logistical difficulties exponentially. Every vehicle type represented another supply chain to maintain, another set of specifications to meet, another opportunity for the system to break down. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message that sealed his fate. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. The message was brief, almost bureaucratic in its finality, but it represented the end of German offensive capability in the West. Peiper called his remaining commanders together for what would be their final planning meeting. Sturmbannführer Werner Pötzsch was bluntly realistic in his assessment. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. According to Hauptsturmführer Grüller's post-war testimony, Peiper addressed his officers with stark honesty. Gentlemen, we have discovered that we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed miraculous to us, was absolutely nothing to them. We simply cannot win this kind of war. This devastating realization was spreading throughout German ranks like a contagion of despair. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, would later write, "When I learned that the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it truly began. We were fighting an enemy who possessed resources on a scale that made our calculations meaningless." Colonel Friedrich Kittel, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators with bitter honesty, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate bars that my men haven't seen in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons of fuel while we measure our supplies by the liter. How can any army fight against such abundance? It's not warfare, it's industrial suicide." By December 21st, Peiper found himself surrounded at La Gleize, his once mighty tanks now immobilized steel monuments to German miscalculation. The American forces encircling his position, elements of the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored Division, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper commanded perhaps 1,000 gallons total, barely enough to keep his command vehicle running. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home to his family with unconscious irony, "We've got Germans surrounded here who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we probably use more fuel heating our coffee than they have left for their tanks." This casual comment captured the essence of the disparity better than any statistical analysis could achieve. The American response to the German offensive demonstrated industrial warfare operating at its absolute peak of efficiency and power. General Patton's famous Third Army pivot from the Saar to the Ardennes required 350,000 gallons of fuel just for the redeployment movement, an operation considered impossible by German standards yet accomplished in just 3 days through superior logistics and unlimited resources. December 23rd brought clear winter weather for the first time since the offensive began, and with it came the full weight of Allied air power. American and British aircraft flew 2,000 sorties in a single day, each mission burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour of operation, while B-26 Marauders burned through 200 gallons hourly. One day's air operations alone consumed more fuel than Germany's entire offensive allocation, yet it represented merely routine operations for the Allied air forces. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, facing the complete collapse of his position and the annihilation of his remaining forces, Peiper made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered the abandonment of all vehicles and equipment, leading his surviving men in a desperate escape on foot through the frozen Ardennes forests. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive with such high hopes, only 39 remained operational, but even these had to be destroyed due to lack of fuel to move them. Obersturmführer Heinz Goltz described the final scene with haunting detail. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total from our entire remaining force. The Obersturmführer personally destroyed his command tank with a Panzerfaust. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment destroyed not by enemy action, but by empty fuel tanks. Of the 5,000 elite soldiers who had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 would eventually return to German lines. They had advanced 60 miles into Belgium, captured several important depots, and in doing so had discovered a truth about Allied logistics that would haunt them for the remainder of the war. News of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through the German command structure like wildfire through dry forest. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received detailed reports on the captured American supplies and the fuel burned at Stavelot. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than risk capture. He was quiet for a long moment, then said simply, "We are not fighting the same war as our enemy." When Hitler was informed on December 28th, he initially refused to accept the reality of what had occurred. Albert Speer wrote in his memoirs, "Hitler insisted the reported numbers were Allied propaganda designed to demoralize our forces." When shown actual photographs of the burning depot at Stavelot, he claimed they were Hollywood special effects. But those of us in lower ranks understood the truth all too clearly. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife with devastating clarity, "The Americans destroy more fuel in a single day than we receive in an entire month. They drive their tanks like we would march infantry. This war is already lost. We just haven't admitted it yet." The fuel crisis that paralyzed German forces was symptomatic of a much larger truth about the balance of industrial power in World War II. By 1944, the United States alone produced 50% of the world's total manufacturing output. American factories were completing a new aircraft every 5 minutes, launching a new ship every single day, and rolling a new tank off production lines every 7 minutes around the clock. The petroleum production statistics told a story of overwhelming disparity that no amount of tactical skill or soldier courage could overcome. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944, while the Soviet Union managed 110 million barrels. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian oil fields, scraped together just 33 million barrels. Japan contributed a mere 2.6 million barrels to the Axis total. Combined, Germany and Japan produced less than 2% of American petroleum output, a mathematical impossibility for sustained mechanized warfare. Every major German offensive operation after 1942 had been fundamentally constrained by fuel shortages, while every American offensive was supported by an abundance that German planners literally could not conceive. The disparity had become so extreme that it resembled something from different centuries of warfare entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing incident on December 27th that perfectly captured this disparity. An American logistics officer reported with apparent concern that bad weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was brief worry until someone pointed out that this supposedly inadequate amount still exceeded Germany's total allocation for the entire Ardennes offensive. German prisoners of war captured during the Battle of the Bulge consistently reported being more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. Seeing GIs casually discard half-eaten K rations or use precious gasoline for heating purposes shattered German morale more effectively than artillery bombardments. The psychological impact of witnessing such casual abundance was devastating to soldiers who had been taught that Germans possessed superior efficiency and organization. Obergefreiter Hans Reichhelm told his interrogators, "We knew your production numbers in abstract terms from our intelligence reports, but seeing your soldiers actually waste more supplies than our entire unit possessed made those numbers terrifyingly real. Every German soldier who witnessed your casual abundance knew in his heart that this war was already hopeless." This knowledge spread through the German ranks via letters home despite strict censorship efforts. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote to his family, "The Americans wash their clothes in gasoline because it's more convenient. They feed chocolate to their dogs. They fire artillery barrages just to celebrate Christmas. How can any nation fight against such infinite resources?" The psychological impact of American abundance undermined core Nazi propaganda narratives about racial superiority and German efficiency. How could the supposedly decadent Americans possess such overwhelming wealth and power while the master race was reduced to scraping for basic necessities? The contradiction was too glaring to ignore, too fundamental to explain away with ideology. During the Nuremberg war crimes trials, German military leaders would consistently cite logistics, particularly fuel shortages, as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified, "We maintained operational superiority from 1940 to 1941, but by 1944 we couldn't effectively move major formations due to fuel shortages, while the Americans moved the entire armies around like chess pieces on a board." Even Peiper himself, when tried for the Malmedy massacre, offered testimony that revealed how thoroughly fuel concerns had influenced every German decision. Every tactical choice we made after December 17th was fundamentally influenced by fuel shortage considerations. We couldn't maneuver effectively, pursue retreating enemies, or conduct organized retreats. The Americans moved with complete freedom while we counted every liter like misers hoarding gold. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, wrote in his memoirs, "When Peiper captured those 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, an amount that meant everything to his mission but represented absolutely nothing to the Americans, I knew the war was effectively over. We were fighting industrial mathematics, not another army." The story of Kampfgruppe Peiper resonates through military history because it represents the moment when traditional notions of warfare finally died in the face of industrial reality. Wars between major powers would no longer be won by superior tactics, soldier courage, or even brilliant generalship. Victory belonged to whichever side could produce more steel, aluminum, petroleum, and aircraft. The romantic conception of warfare as a test of national character or military virtue was buried forever in the snows of the Ardennes, alongside empty German fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy, the distinguished military historian, calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-1 in most major military categories. In petroleum production, the ratio approached 50-1. These overwhelming advantages could not be overcome through superior training, tactical innovation, or even desperate sacrifice. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate arbiter of victory, rendering traditional military virtues almost irrelevant. The production statistics tell the complete story with devastating clarity. America manufactured 324,750 aircraft during the entire war compared to Germany's 119,871. Americans built 88,410 tanks while Germany produced 46,857. But most tellingly of all, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany struggled to produce 33 million barrels through synthetic processes and captured resources. On December 24, 1944, as Peiper's surviving soldiers slipped through American lines on foot like ghosts, abandoning 39 operational tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the full magnitude of their discovery crystallized with brutal clarity. They had captured 50,000 gallons of fuel and initially celebrated it as miraculous good fortune, only to learn that it represented less than a rounding error in American daily consumption, meaningless to an enemy who could afford to burn millions rather than risk minor tactical disadvantage. Unterscharführer Weber reflected decades later in 1975, that morning at Hansfeld, finding all that American fuel, we celebrated like men who had won the lottery. By evening, after learning about stavelet burning and seeing those supply reports, we understood that we had already lost everything that mattered. The Americans had so much fuel that they could destroy what we would have died to possess. The 50,000 gallons that had seemed so precious to Peiper's forces represented less than what a single American armored division consumed in 2 days of normal operations, less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours of routine deliveries. It was, in the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare, completely insignificant. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote, "The Germans' desperate attempts to capture our fuel supplies revealed the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of their strategy. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, as an irreplaceable, precious resource to be hoarded and protected. They simply could not comprehend that we possessed such abundance that we could burn millions of gallons rather than accept even minor tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare rather than any failure of German courage or tactical skill. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons of fuel, 60% from their original allocation, 40% from captured American supplies. During the same period, American forces consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more, while simultaneously building strategic reserves for future operations. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men during the Ardennes offensive, along with 800 irreplaceable tanks and 1,000 aircraft. But the most devastating loss was the final destruction of German illusions about their chances of victory. Every German soldier who witnessed American logistical abundance understood with crushing certainty that Germany was no longer fighting a war. They were participating in their own methodical execution by an enemy whose resources operated on scales that made German scarcity completely irrelevant. Joachim Peiper survived the war, spending 11 years in prison for war crimes before his release in 1956. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his home in France by unknown assailants, the final victim of hatreds that had outlived the war itself. But in 1967, 9 years before his death, he told military historian Henry Lehman, "Finding that depot at Hansfeld was perhaps the worst thing that could have happened to us. If we had simply run out of fuel earlier, we might have been able to retreat with some dignity intact. Instead, we discovered that the Americans had oceans of fuel while we were fighting over drops. We discovered the complete impossibility of our situation." The lesson extends far beyond World War II to encompass the fundamental nature of warfare between industrial powers. In mechanized conflict, logistics supersedes tactics, production capacity overwhelms individual courage, and abundance defeats dedication regardless of its intensity. The German soldiers of 1944 were arguably better trained, more experienced, and more tactically skilled than their American counterparts. None of it mattered in the face of an industrial machine that could afford to waste more resources than Germany could produce. This harsh truth was encoded in every jerrycan at Hansfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline stretching across liberated France. Future wars between major industrial powers would be decided in factories and refineries rather than on battlefields by brilliant generals. The age of heroic warfare had ended in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, replaced by the cold mathematics of production statistics and supply chains. Colonel Trevor Dupuy later calculated that by December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies delivered daily, while each German soldier received approximately 3 pounds. The Americans complained about logistical inefficiency and waste, yet what they considered wasteful abundance would have represented unimaginable luxury to their German opponents. The gap between the two military systems had become so vast that they might as well have been fighting wars separated by centuries rather than battle lines. In 1984, exactly 40 years after the battle, veterans from both sides gathered at L'Église for a commemoration ceremony. The local museum displays Peiper's Tiger tank, still positioned where it had run out of fuel on December 23, 1944, a steel monument to the moment when tactical excellence met logistical reality and was utterly defeated. Former Unterscharführer Karl Wertmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division, two old men contemplating the machine that had brought them together as enemies 4 decades earlier. "We always wondered why you stopped advancing," Anderson said quietly. "We thought it must have been some kind of tactical decision, regrouping for another attack." Wertmann laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "We stopped because our tanks were completely empty of fuel. You burned millions of gallons to keep them from us. How could any army fight against such abundance?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment, then replied with the honesty of age, "We never really knew you were that desperate for fuel. We had so much that we never thought about it as a limiting factor. It was just always there when we needed it." That brief exchange between two elderly veterans captured the essential truth of December 1944 better than any strategic analysis ever could. One side had fought the entire campaign, measuring fuel by individual gallons, treating each jerrycan as precious beyond measure. The other side had operated with such abundance that they could burn millions of gallons without strategic concern, treating petroleum as an unlimited resource. The outcome had been predetermined by industrial mathematics rather than military valor. German military records provide damning evidence of this disparity throughout the offensive. Army Group B's War Diary tells the story in stark statistical terms. December 16th, offensive begins with fuel supplies at 70% of minimum requirements. December 17th, Peiper captures 50,000 gallons, temporarily solving immediate crisis. December 18th, multiple fuel depots destroyed by retreating Americans, over 5 million gallons lost to German forces. December 19th, fuel situation becomes critical, entire units immobilized. December 24th, Peiper abandons all vehicles due to complete fuel exhaustion. Meanwhile, the American First Army's logistics reports for the same period paint a picture of almost casual abundance. December 16th, fuel reserves stand at 3.7 million gallons. December 17th, 2.2 million gallons destroyed to deny enemy capture. December 18th, 1.8 million gallons received through normal supply channels. December 24th, reserves increased to 4.1 million gallons despite intensive combat operations. The Americans treated millions of gallons with bureaucratic indifference, processing these massive quantities as routine paperwork entries, while Germans treasured individual containers like family heirlooms. The psychological impact of this discovery would haunt German forces for the remainder of the war, destroying any remaining illusions about their chances of ultimate victory. Beyond mere quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority that Germany could not match or even fully understand. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking processes, producing higher-octane gasoline more efficiently than German hydrogenation plants could manage even under ideal conditions. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave Allied aircraft decisive performance advantages over German planes running on 87-octane synthetic fuel produced in increasingly damaged facilities. American petroleum engineers had also perfected fuel additives that Germany could not replicate: tetraethyl lead for improved engine performance, ethylene compounds for cold weather operation, dibromide detergents for engine cleanliness. These technical advances represented not just superior engineering, but an industrial infrastructure capable of supporting such sophisticated production while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The fuel shortage shaped every aspect of the German soldiers' experience during the Ardennes campaign. Gefreiter Hans Muller recorded on December 20th, "Marched 30 kilometers today through snow. No fuel available for trucks for transport. Past abandoned American vehicles with engines still running to provide heat for their crews. They leave engines running for comfort while we march through freezing conditions." The contrast is almost impossible to believe. Medical services throughout the German forces were crippled by fuel shortages in ways that cost countless lives. Ambulances could not evacuate wounded soldiers from forward positions, field hospitals could not run generators for surgical equipment, and men died waiting for transportation that never came because the fuel had been allocated to combat vehicles instead. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kesting testified after the war, "We had excellent surgeons and adequate medical supplies captured from American positions, but no fuel for ambulances or medical vehicles. Wounded soldiers died who could easily have been saved with just 10 kilometers of transport to proper facilities. It was heartbreaking to watch men perish from treatable injuries simply because we lacked the fuel to move them." These discoveries systematically shattered German propaganda narratives about American weakness and decadence. German soldiers had been told for years that Americans were soft, materialistic, and incapable of sustaining serious military operations. Then they discovered that these supposedly weak Americans could afford to destroy more military resources than the master race possessed, could waste more fuel in a day than German divisions received in months of careful rationing. Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary on December 28th, "Reports from the Ardennes indicate serious morale problems among our forces. Soldiers are writing home about American material superiority in ways that directly undermine our carefully constructed narrative about enemy weakness. The stories spread faster than our censorship efforts can contain them. But no amount of censorship could suppress what German soldiers had seen with their own eyes. The myth of German technological and organizational superiority simply could not survive direct contact with American logistical abundance. Every jerrycan at Hansfeld, every burning depot at Stavelot, every pipeline across France provided irrefutable evidence that Germany's understanding of modern warfare had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. The failure of the Ardennes offensive meant that Germany had exhausted its final strategic reserves and had no remaining options except desperate defensive warfare. General Alfred Jodl testified at the Nuremberg trials, "After the failure in the Ardennes, we knew with absolute certainty that the war was lost. We had played our last strategic card and discovered that our enemy held all the aces in a game we had never truly understood." Recognizing the complete German dependence on captured fuel, Allied planners intensified their focus on destroying petroleum production and distribution facilities throughout German-held territory. By February 1945, German synthetic fuel production had ceased entirely. The Luftwaffe was permanently grounded, pilot training programs were canceled, and the Wehrmacht became essentially static, destroyed piecemeal by mobile enemies who moved with complete freedom, while German forces remained tethered to defensive positions by fuel scarcity. The spring of 1945 brought surreal scenes across the collapsing German front lines. Entire units surrendered not from military defeat but from complete immobility, unable to maneuver or even retreat effectively. General Major Fritz Bayerlein described the final weeks. "We had 42 operational tanks with experienced crews and adequate ammunition. We also had exactly 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town, much less conduct military operations. We destroyed our own tanks with Panzerfausts and walked into captivity because movement had become impossible. Meanwhile, The American advance was constrained only by traffic jams caused by the sheer abundance of their military vehicles. Patton's Third Army alone operated over 15,000 vehicles of various types, while the entire German defense of Western Europe could barely keep a few hundred tanks operational due to fuel shortages. Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis perfectly demonstrates how industrial capacity, rather than military skill, determined World War II's ultimate outcome. When Peiper stood among those captured jerry cans on that December morning in 1944, he glimpsed a fundamental truth that would define all future warfare between industrialized nations. They were fighting an enemy whose casual waste exceeded German strategic needs, whose logistical abundance operated on scales that made German scarcity calculations completely irrelevant. The numbers provide the final, definitive proof of this disparity. Germany's total fuel allocation for the Ardennes offensive, 5 million gallons. Fuel deliberately destroyed by Americans to deny German capture, 8 million gallons. Daily American fuel consumption during the campaign, 7.5 million gallons. Peiper's miraculous capture at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons, representing 0.6% of American daily consumption, essentially a rounding error in Allied logistical calculations. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 American soldiers and perhaps 100,000 Germans while destroying the Wehrmacht's final strategic reserves. But its most lasting impact was the spread of knowledge throughout German ranks that America possessed industrial abundance on a scale that made continued resistance not just futile, but almost absurd in its mathematical impossibility. Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld was not simply about fuel, it was about the fundamental nature of industrial warfare in the modern age. Victory belonged entirely to whichever nation could produce the most petroleum, steel, aluminum, and aircraft. Germany had never possessed even a theoretical chance of victory once American industrial capacity was fully mobilized for war production. The final irony came when American forces cataloged the abandoned German equipment at Log-Lees after Peiper's escape. They found 39 perfectly functional tanks abandoned solely due to lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted with bureaucratic precision, fuel required for recovery operations, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal expenditure. Source, local reserves. Estimated time for completion, 4 hours. What represented an impossible logistical challenge for the Germans, 8,000 gallons to save their most advanced tanks, was beneath American notice, a minor requisition using local fuel reserves that exceeded Kampfgruppe Peiper's total strength at its peak. This perfectly encapsulated Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld. Not merely that America possessed more fuel than Germany, but that American abundance operated on scales that made German scarcity completely meaningless in strategic terms. The war had been decided when American industrial capacity fully mobilized in 1943, but Hansfeld was where this truth became undeniably visible to those who had believed in German victory. Germany had been fighting an impossible war since 1942, measuring their potential defeat in gallons and liters while America measured its inevitable victory in oceans of petroleum abundance. Today, Peiper's Tiger tank sits silent in the museum at Log-Lees, its fuel gauge permanently reading empty, a steel monument to the moment when tactical excellence encountered logistical reality and discovered that modern warfare had fundamentally changed. Visitors often ask museum guides why such powerful, advanced tanks were simply abandoned rather than fought to destruction. The answer, carved into history by empty fuel tanks and burning depots across the Ardennes, remains beautifully simple. They had no fuel to continue fighting, while their enemies possessed so much that they could afford to burn millions of gallons rather than risk minor tactical disadvantage. In that disparity lies the entire story of how World War II was truly won and lost, not on battlefields but in refineries, factories, and the vast logistical networks that connected American abundance to European battlegrounds where German scarcity had finally met its mathematical nemesis.